I first noticed it 3 weeks after we moved into the house. Sarah, my wife, had always been a quiet woman, reserved, thoughtful, but lately she had taken to whispering in empty rooms. At first, I thought nothing of it. We were still adjusting to our new home, an old Victorian with creaking floors and shadowed corners. And maybe she was just thinking out loud. But then I began waking up at night to the sound of her murmuring. She would sit at the edge of the bed, facing the darkness, her lips moving as though she were deep in conversation. When I asked her who she was talking to, she would blink at me, dazed, as if she had no idea what I meant. "No one," she would say, her voice distant. But the way she said it, the way her eyes seemed unfocused, her expression slightly strained, made me uneasy. One evening, as I walked past the study, I heard her again. This time, I paused by the door, listening. Her voice was hushed, urgent, responding to something I couldn't hear. "But I don't understand," she was saying. "Why would you say that?" A long silence. Then her voice dropped to a whisper so low I could barely make out the words. "That can't be true. He wouldn't lie to me." A chill ran through me. She wasn't just talking, she was arguing. The thought made my stomach twist. Swallowing my unease, I pushed open the door. Sarah sat in the armchair, facing the empty corner of the room, her hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles were white. She turned to me, startled, her face pale. "James," she breathed, "I didn't hear you." I forced a smile. "Who were you talking to?" Her expression wavered. "No one," she said again, and I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. I didn't press her, but that night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house felt like a breath at my ear. Every shadow seemed to shift. And then, just as I was finally drifting off, Sarah spoke. "She says you're lying to me." My eyes snapped open. She lay beside me, her back to me, but her voice was different, flat, unfamiliar. "Who?" I asked, my throat dry. Sarah didn't move. For a long moment, I thought she had fallen back asleep. But then, in that same lifeless tone, she whispered, "The woman in the walls." I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, stiff as a corpse, staring at the ceiling while Sarah breathed softly beside me. The room was suffocatingly silent, but my mind echoed with her words. "The woman in the walls." I told myself it was just sleep talk, some meaningless fragment of a dream. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I watched Sarah carefully. She moved through the house as if nothing had happened, humming softly as she made coffee, reading the news like any other day, but there was something different, something just beneath the surface. She paused in doorways too long, her head tilted like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. And when I spoke to her, she took a second too long to respond, as if being pulled back from somewhere else. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. "Sarah," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Last night, you said something strange in your sleep." She looked up from her book, her expression unreadable. "Did I?" "You mentioned the woman in the walls." The room seemed to shrink around us. For a moment, I thought she might laugh, brush it off, but instead, she just stared at me, her fingers tightening around the pages. "I don't remember that," she said finally, but there was hesitation in her voice, a crack in the facade. I let it go, for now. But that evening, after Sarah went to bed, I stayed up, searching for answers. I dug through old newspapers online, looking up anything about our house. It had stood for over a century, changing hands dozens of times. And then I found it, A single article from 1956. Local woman missing. Evelyn Mercer vanishes from family home. I clicked the article, my hands cold. Evelyn Mercer, the woman who had once lived here, had disappeared without a trace. No body, no evidence, just gone. Her husband, a wealthy businessman, claimed she left him, but neighbors spoke of hearing screams at night. Some even swore they saw her in the windows after she vanished, staring out with hollow eyes. My pulse hammered in my ears. I shut the laptop and stood, listening to the house. It was silent, but not empty. There was a weight to the air, an unseen presence pressing against my skin. And then I heard it. A whisper, so faint, I almost convinced myself I imagined it. She knows. I turned so fast, my chair toppled over. My breath came in sharp gasps, my eyes darting around the room. There was no one there, but in the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light, I saw the faintest shift of shadow. The next morning, I woke to find Sarah sitting up in bed, her face pale. She turned to me, her eyes wide with something close to fear. "James?" she whispered. "She was in the room last night, watching you." A shudder rolled through me. "Who?" Sarah swallowed hard. "The woman in the walls." I tried to convince myself that Sarah was dreaming, that I was imagining things, but the way she looked at me, wide-eyed, almost bleeding, made it impossible to ignore. That morning, she barely spoke. She drifted through the house, staring at the walls, flinching at sounds I couldn't hear. And when I asked if she was okay, she only said, "She's getting closer." By evening, the house felt different, colder. The air had a strange weight to it, thick and oppressive. The lights flickered, but only for Sarah. I saw it happen. She'd walk into a room, and the bulbs would dim, casting long, trembling shadows against the walls. The moment she left, they'd return to normal. Then came the scratching. It started that night, just as I was drifting off. A faint, rhythmic sound, like nails dragging along wood. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to locate the source. It was coming from inside the walls. I shook Sarah awake, but she only turned to me with glassy eyes. "She's trying to get out," she murmured, her voice barely above a breath. I pressed my ear to the wall. The scratching stopped. Then, just as I pulled away, a single deliberate knock sounded from within. I jerked back, nearly falling out of bed. "Sarah, we need to leave," I said, grabbing her hand. She didn't move. Her fingers were ice cold. Slowly, she turned her head toward me, and my stomach dropped. Her pupils were blown wide, her lips slightly parted, her breath coming in short gasps. And then, in a voice that was not hers, she whispered, "James, she says you should have told me the truth." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" Sarah blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if waking from a trance. "James," she whispered, her own voice returning. I don't feel right." I held her, my mind racing. "The truth? What truth?" I had never lied to Sarah, at least not about anything that mattered. But the moment I thought that, something deep inside me twisted. A memory stirred, something I had ignored for years. Sarah had chosen this house. She was drawn to it from the moment she saw it, even though I told her we should keep looking. And now, a horrible thought took root. What if she was never the one who chose it? What if it had chosen her? That night I stayed awake, listening to the house breathe. The scratching returned, more frantic now, like something trapped just beyond my reach. And then, just before dawn, I heard it. A voice, soft, female, and unbearably sad, whispering from the walls. She deserves to know. I couldn't run from it anymore. The house wasn't just haunted. It was demanding something from me and Sarah. She was slipping away, caught in its grasp. The voice in the walls wanted her to know something. Something I had buried deep in the past. That morning, Sarah barely spoke. She sat at the dining table, stirring her coffee absently, her eyes distant. I could see her lips moving, whispering, but I heard nothing. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched as if I had burned her. She's getting louder, she murmured. I think she's inside me now. Panic clawed at my throat. I needed answers, so I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't. I went into the basement. The air was thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. Old furniture and boxes cluttered the space. But my attention was drawn to the farthest wall. It was different from the others. Newer. A patch job. A shoddy one at that. My hands trembled as I grabbed a crowbar and pried at the wood. The moment the first plank gave way, a putrid stench spilled into the room. Something rotten. Something dead. I kept going, my breath shallow, sweat slicking my skin, and then I saw it. Bones. Human bones. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. A dress, tattered and stained, clung to the remains, but I didn't need more evidence. I knew who she was. Evelyn Mercer. My mind reeled. Had her husband killed her? Sealed her away in these walls like she was nothing? My hands shook as I reached for my phone, but then a whisper right behind me. You knew. I spun around, heart hammering. The basement light flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness. When it came back on, Sarah stood at the top of the stairs. Her face was blank, her posture unnaturally stiff. James, she said, her voice hollow. Why didn't you tell me? My mouth went dry. Tell you? What? She stepped forward, slowly descending the stairs. Shadows clung to her like a second skin. You've been here before, she whispered. Haven't you? Memories surged through me. The open house. The way the realtor hesitated before showing us the basement. The strange familiarity I felt when we first stepped inside. And then, years before that, a blurred recollection of wandering into a home with my father, a place he was working on. My father had been a contractor, a fixer of houses, but not just that, a cover-up man. Cold realization settled over me like a death shroud. He had worked for Evelyn's husband. He had sealed her into the walls. And I had been there as a child, watching, unaware of what was happening. Sarah's eyes darkened, her voice merging with another, with hers. You let me rot. The basement door slammed shut. The light flickered out, and then the screaming began. The basement was a black void. The air felt thicker, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. Sarah's body twitched, her head tilting in a way that wasn't human. The voice that came from her mouth was layered. Sarah's, but also Evelyn's. You let me rot. My pulse pounded in my ears. Sarah, listen to me. You have to fight this. I took a step forward, but she jerked back, her limbs rigid like a marionette on strings. She's not here right now, Sarah whispered. But the voice wasn't hers anymore. It was cold, distant. Only me, only Evelyn. The light above flickered violently, casting the room into a disorienting strobe of shadows. The walls groaned as if the house itself was breathing. Then the whispering started, dozens of voices circling me, closing in. Liar? Murderer? You let it happen? The bones at my feet shifted. I gasped as the dress, tattered and soaked in years of decay, moved as if something still lived inside it. Then Sarah lunged at me. I barely dodged, crashing into the wall as she shrieked. Her hands clawed at the air, at me, at something unseen. Her pupils had vanished, her eyes two black voids reflecting nothing. She won't leave until you tell the truth. A crushing weight pressed on my chest. I could feel it now, her rage, her pain, seeping into my skin like poison. She had waited decades for this moment. She wouldn't be ignored. My mind raced. I couldn't change the past. I hadn't been the one to kill her, but I had been there. I had been complicit in my silence, even if I hadn't understood it then. And that was why she was haunting me. The house groaned again, a deep, mournful sound that rattled my bones. The scratching in the walls turned to pounding. Desperate, angry, Evelyn wasn't alone. The house held more secrets. I staggered forward, gripping Sarah's shoulders. Evelyn, listen to me. You were murdered. You were buried in these walls like you were nothing. But you were someone. You deserved better. I should have... My voice cracked. I should have remembered sooner. Sarah gasped. Her body seized, then went limp in my arms. The air shifted. The temperature rose. And then, silence. For the first time since moving in, the house felt empty. The walls no longer breathed. The voices no longer whispered. Sarah stirred in my arms, her breathing shallow. James? I pulled her close, my heart hammering. It's over, I whispered. She's gone. The house let us go that night. We left without packing, abandoning everything inside. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood still, its windows dark and empty. But just before we turned the corner, I saw it. A shadow in the upstairs window, watching, because a house never forgets.